The formation of the Galicia Division, officially known as the 14th Waffen Grenadier Division of the SS, 1st Galician, must be understood within the complex and often volatile context of Central and Eastern Europe during the interwar period and the early years of the Second World War. The shifting borders, political instability, and deeply rooted ethnic tensions set the stage for a controversial military formation whose legacy remains contentious. Following the collapse of the Austro-Hungarian Empire in 1918, the region of eastern Galicia became a contested space. The short-lived West Ukrainian People's Republic, proclaimed in Lviv in November 1918, was suppressed by Polish forces during the Polish-Ukrainian War. The Treaty of Riga in 1921 formalized Polish control over the region, despite opposition from local Ukrainian communities. During the interwar years, Galicia remained under the Second Polish Republic, with significant Ukrainian, Polish, and Jewish populations. The Ukrainian majority in the countryside frequently clashed with Polish authorities over language rights, education, and political representation. Ukrainian political movements during the 1920s and 1930s evolved in response to repression and exclusion. Mainstream parties such as the Ukrainian National Democratic Alliance, UNDO, sought autonomy through legal means, while radical factions, particularly the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, OUN, adopted a strategy of sabotage and targeted violence. Founded in 1929, the OUN combined ethno-nationalist ideology with anti-communist and anti-Polish sentiment. Its leadership was influenced by authoritarian European movements and increasingly favored violent methods to achieve Ukrainian independence. The geopolitical landscape changed dramatically in 1939. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union led to the joint invasion and division of Poland. Eastern Galicia was annexed by the Soviet Union and incorporated into the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic. Soviet rule in the region was marked by widespread arrests, executions, and deportations, targeting former Polish officials, Ukrainian nationalists, and the local intelligentsia. Between 1939 and 1941, over 300,000 people were deported from western Ukraine to Siberia and Central Asia. The Soviet NKVD targeted both Ukrainian and Polish elites, aiming to dismantle potential sources of resistance. When Germany launched Operation Barbarossa on 22 June 1941, Soviet forces quickly retreated from Galicia. German forces captured Lviv within days. The vacuum left by Soviet withdrawal was filled temporarily by local Ukrainian groups, some of which collaborated with the advancing Wehrmacht. The German occupation reconfigured existing tensions. Nazi policies rejected Ukrainian independence outright. The brief proclamation of a Ukrainian state by the OUN-B faction under Stepan Bandera on 30 June 1941 was swiftly annulled, and Bandera was arrested by the Germans in July. Despite this betrayal, German authorities saw utility in exploiting Ukrainian anti-Soviet sentiment. Civilian administration in Galicia was assigned to the general government rather than the Reichskommissariat Ukraine, reflecting its former Austrian ties. Throughout 1941-1942, the German military administration recruited Ukrainians into auxiliary police battalions and civilian labor forces. However, the idea of a formal Ukrainian military unit under German command remained contentious until the situation on the Eastern Front deteriorated. By early 1943, the Wehrmacht was suffering massive losses following defeats at Stalingrad and in the Caucasus. The Red Army was advancing westward, and the German High Command faced acute manpower shortages. Heinrich Himmler, head of the SS, authorized the expansion of Waffen-SS foreign divisions, particularly from non-Germanic populations considered politically useful. In this context, the proposal for a Ukrainian division from Galicia gained traction. The initiative for the division came from multiple sources. German authorities in the general government supported the idea as a means of securing rear areas and combating Soviet partisans. Ukrainian leaders in Galicia, particularly those affiliated with the Ukrainian Central Committee in Krakow and the Greek Catholic Church, viewed the proposal as an opportunity to safeguard Galician Ukrainians from mass conscription into German labor or police units, to build a military structure under partial Ukrainian command, and to position themselves politically in the post-war order. Bishop Andrei Sheptytsky, the head of the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church, gave cautious endorsement to the formation, framing it as a necessary step to protect the population and resist communism. Ukrainian press outlets under German supervision promoted enlistment through appeals to patriotism, anti-Bolshevism, and the defense of Galicia. In a climate where most political parties were banned and direct calls for Ukrainian independence were prohibited, the promise of limited autonomy through military service held considerable appeal. Enlistment for the division began in April 1943. Approximately 80,000 men volunteered in the initial wave, far exceeding German expectations. From this pool, around 13,000 were selected for training, forming the core of what would become the 14th Waffen Grenadier Division of the SS, Galicia Nr. 1. Although the unit bore the SS designation, most of its members were not ideologically aligned with Nazism. For many recruits, the choice reflected pragmatic motivations: avoiding deportation to labor camps, securing better treatment for their families, or pursuing the idea, however illusory, of a future autonomous Ukrainian force. The German command retained full control over the division's structure and deployment. Ukrainian hopes for political concessions were largely ignored. The unit's officers were predominantly German, although several Ukrainian commanders were appointed at junior levels. Training began in June 1943 at the SS training camps in Heidelager, now Pustkov, Poland, and later in Neuhammer, Świętoszów. Conditions were harsh, with rigorous drills, German military doctrine, and political indoctrination. From the outset, the Galicia Division existed at the intersection of competing loyalties and strategic calculations. Its creation was driven by German military necessity, Ukrainian political ambition, and the brutal reality of war on the Eastern Front. While some viewed the formation as a betrayal, aligning with an occupying force responsible for repression and genocide, others saw it as a constrained opportunity to assert Ukrainian agency in a world dominated by hostile empires. The decision to form the division would carry severe consequences. In the months and years ahead, its members would be deployed in combat against Soviet forces, involved in controversial security operations, and ultimately face destruction, imprisonment, or exile. Its legacy, forged in the crucible of total war, would remain one of the most divisive chapters in modern Ukrainian history. The formal creation of the Galicia Division was announced in April 1943. Recruits began reporting to training camps throughout the spring and early summer, drawn by a mix of anti-Soviet sentiment, nationalist aspiration, and pragmatic survival. German authorities set the recruitment target at 10,000 to 12,000 men, though initial response far exceeded expectations, with over 80,000 applications submitted. The scale of enthusiasm surprised German planners, who nonetheless screened out a majority of applicants based on age, physical condition, or political reliability. The division was officially designated as the 14th Waffen Grenadier Division of the SS 1st Galician, though the name Galicia Division remained common in both German and Ukrainian usage. The choice to embed the unit within the Waffen-SS hierarchy was a deliberate one. Heinrich Himmler believed that foreign divisions within the SS would demonstrate loyalty and discipline superior to regular army auxiliaries. The SS command structure also permitted ideological oversight, ensuring that recruits were subjected to German military training standards and political conditioning, even if few Ukrainians adhered to National Socialist principles. Recruits were sent to SS training camps in occupied Poland, primarily to Heidelager near Dębica, and later to the larger facility at Neuhammer in Silesia. Training emphasized German drill, infantry tactics, weapons proficiency, and ideological instruction. The language of command was German. While some Ukrainian officers were promoted to junior ranks, key leadership positions remained under German control. This included divisional command, logistics, and field intelligence. Fritz Freytag, a former Wehrmacht officer who had transferred to the SS, was appointed commander of the division. Freytag had combat experience on the Eastern Front and was familiar with Slavic auxiliaries. He oversaw the development of the division's structure, which followed the standard Waffen-SS model, comprising 3 infantry regiments, artillery units, engineer and signal detachments, and supporting services. Ukrainian officers and non-commissioned officers were gradually promoted within limits, particularly for internal discipline and morale maintenance. Throughout the summer of 1943, the Galicia Division underwent formation and training. However, by this time, the situation on the Eastern Front had shifted dramatically. The Wehrmacht had suffered major defeats at Stalingrad and in the Kursk salient. Soviet forces were pushing westward, liberating large parts of Ukraine. German units were retreating, and partisan activity was intensifying, especially in the forested and rural areas behind the front. As a result, the division's formation coincided with rising political and military instability. German desperation for reinforcements meant the division would not be kept in reserve for long. Despite having limited combat readiness, plans were made to deploy it within a few months. The choice of its first assignment reflected this urgency. In July 1944, with the Red Army advancing into southeastern Poland, the Galicia Division was ordered to the area of Brody, a town northwest of Lviv, to help stabilize German lines during the Soviet Lvov-Sandomierz offensive. The decision to send the division to the Brody sector was made by the German High Command as a stopgap measure to fill a collapsing front. German Army Group North Ukraine, under General Joseph Harp, was attempting to block the Soviet First Ukrainian Front, commanded by Marshal Ivan Konev. Konev had launched a major offensive on 13 July 1944, with the goal of encircling and destroying German forces in western Ukraine and opening the road to Poland. The Galicia Division, still incomplete in terms of equipment and lacking combat experience, was attached to the 13th Army Corps of the 4th Panzer Army. Alongside other depleted or improvised German formations, the division was positioned in a vulnerable salient around Brody, surrounded by Soviet armored and infantry units. Despite warnings about the overextended position, German commanders insisted on holding the line, hoping to buy time for strategic withdrawal elsewhere. For many in the division, the deployment to Brody marked the first contact with active Soviet forces. The men were ordered into defensive positions, expected to hold sectors against overwhelming Soviet numerical and artillery superiority. The terrain, low hills, river crossings, and villages provided limited natural defenses. Coordination between German and Ukrainian units was complicated by language barriers, inconsistent communication, and command friction. Ukrainian officers were not always informed of broader operational developments, and the division's integration into German command chains remained incomplete. Civilians in the Brody region faced immediate danger. Soviet air and artillery strikes preceded the ground offensive, causing widespread destruction in surrounding settlements. German forces conducted scorched earth withdrawals and occasional forced conscription of local labor. Partisan activity disrupted logistics and further destabilized rear areas. For many local Ukrainians, the presence of a Ukrainian-identified division in SS uniform created confusion and suspicion. Some welcomed the soldiers as defenders, others saw them as collaborators, deepening divisions within the civilian population. On 18th July 1944, the Red Army began encircling the German 13th Corps, including the Galicia Division. The Soviet plan, well coordinated and supported by massive artillery barrages and mobile armored spearheads, rapidly collapsed the German flanks. The Galicia Division found itself cut off from the main retreating German formations. Attempts to break out were repelled or misdirected. By 22nd July, the encirclement was complete. The engagement that followed would become known as the Battle of Brody. For the Galicia Division, it was a baptism by fire under the most adverse conditions. Lacking air support, with limited artillery and no clear avenue of escape, the division was ordered to hold its positions and prepare for counterattacks that never materialized. For the German command, the division's role had become expendable, a delaying force intended to slow Soviet progress rather than achieve any operational objective. In these early days of combat, the division suffered from disorganization, poor logistical support, and mounting casualties. Soviet forces pushed steadily into the encirclement pocket, reducing defensive positions village by village. Casualties mounted on both sides, but the balance of force and firepower decisively favored the Red Army. The Galicia Division was facing the full momentum of the Soviet summer offensive with minimal external support and under command structures untested in combat. The deployment to Brody marked the end of the division's training phase and its entry into the operational reality of the Eastern Front. Its baptism of fire would result in devastating losses, the destruction of its original structure, and the beginning of a controversial post-war legacy. For now, though, the division's first battle was just beginning, and its outcome would determine the future of both the unit and the narratives that would come to surround it. The operational deployment of the Galicia Division at Brody in July 1944 was shaped not only by military exigency, but by a broader convergence of miscalculation, logistical gaps, and geopolitical desperation. The strategic objective for the German 4th Panzer Army was to delay the Soviet advance long enough to stabilize defensive positions along the Vistula. The Galicia Division, although nominally a Waffen-SS unit, had not yet completed its training cycle and had no prior combat experience. Nevertheless, it was assigned a critical segment of the front within 19th Army Corps, commanded by General Arthur Hoff. The division's positioning placed it at the apex of a salient exposed on 3 sides to the Soviet First Ukrainian Front, which fielded 7 armies, including tank and artillery formations. The Soviet objective under Marshal Ivan Konev's command was to penetrate German lines in western Ukraine, envelop and destroy enemy forces in the Brody sector, and push toward the Carpathians and southeastern Poland. Konev's forces outnumbered the Germans approximately 4-1 in men, 5-1 in artillery pieces, and held a decisive advantage in armor and air support. For the Galicia Division, the strategic premise on deployment was flawed from the outset. German command underestimated Soviet offensive capacity, misjudged the speed and coordination of Konev's multi-army advance, and overestimated the cohesion of recently raised units such as the Galicia Division. Moreover, the area around Brody had poor road infrastructure, which limited rapid maneuvering. Reinforcements and resupply from German rear areas were hampered by constant Soviet air interdiction and partisan sabotage of rail lines. The division, at the time numbering around 11,000 personnel, was deployed in a defensive arc northwest of Brody. Its regiments were distributed across villages such as Pochapi, Zolokiv, and Berestechko. The terrain, gently rolling hills, interspersed with forests and marshland, provided only limited tactical advantage. Ukrainian soldiers dug in using standard German field engineering procedures, establishing machine gun nests, trench systems, and anti-tank obstacles. However, artillery ammunition was in short supply, and mobile reserves were inadequate. Soviet preparatory artillery bombardments began on 13th July and continued intermittently until the main assault on 18th July. Konev committed the 60th Army and elements of the 3rd Guards Tank Army in a broad pincer movement, aiming to envelop 10th Corps and sever their withdrawal routes. Forward elements of the Galicia Division came under heavy shelling, followed by armored probes that quickly overwhelmed exposed forward companies. Attempts by German units to reinforce the front lines were hampered by Soviet air superiority, which denied daylight movement across open ground. The situation deteriorated rapidly. On 19th July, Soviet armor penetrated to the rear of German positions, cutting off the main Brody-Lviv road. Communications between 13th Corps headquarters and the Galicia Division broke down. Orders became inconsistent, and unit cohesion began to fragment. Ukrainian battalion commanders, many of whom had not previously led troops under live-fire conditions, struggled to adapt. Nonetheless, several units mounted localized counterattacks, temporarily halting Soviet advances at key road junctions, but these efforts were unsupported and quickly overwhelmed. By 21st July, the encirclement was complete. Over 45,000 German and Allied troops were trapped, including the entire Galicia Division, as well as elements of several Wehrmacht infantry and artillery regiments. Soviet forces tightened the ring, focusing artillery fire on communication centers and bridges. With resupply impossible and casualties mounting, German command attempted to coordinate breakout efforts. the Galicia Division was ordered to hold the northern perimeter to prevent Soviet reinforcement from reaching key roads, effectively assigning the unit a rearguard role under encirclement. Losses escalated. Soviet infantry, supported by tanks and self-propelled guns, pushed into towns and forests where Galicia Division units had established defensive lines. Fighting devolved into short-range engagements, house-to-house combat, and forest ambushes. Soviet artillery destroyed most of the division's motor pool and reduced its artillery battery to scattered, uncoordinated pieces. Reports indicate that within 3 days of encirclement, over 60% of the division's combat strength had been neutralized, killed, wounded, or captured. Despite these losses, parts of the division maintained discipline and attempted organized resistance. In the forests near Zolokiv and Yaseniv, a group of around 3,000 troops, under the command of Sturmbannführer Pavlo Shandruk and several German officers, launched a breakout attempt. Moving at night and avoiding major roads, they bypassed Soviet forward positions, crossed the southern Bug, and linked up with retreating German forces near Tarnopol by early August. However, most of the division's personnel did not escape. Estimates vary, but it is believed that approximately 7,000 soldiers of the Galicia Division were killed or taken prisoner during the Brody encirclement. Around 3,000 successfully escaped and would form the nucleus for the reconstituted division later in 1944. German casualties in the overall Brody pocket numbered over 30,000, including regular Army, SS, and support personnel. Soviet losses, while significant, were mitigated by overwhelming numerical superiority and armored momentum. The psychological impact of Brody was severe. For many Ukrainian volunteers, the battle shattered any illusions of autonomy within the Waffen-SS structure. The division had been committed to battle prematurely, without sufficient training, logistics, or understanding of its tactical role. Its use as a disposable blocking force, rather than as a national unit, reflected the limits of German willingness to trust or empower non-German formations. Survivors later described the battle as chaotic, disorganized, and marked by a sense of betrayal by the German command hierarchy. At the same time, Soviet propaganda seized upon the destruction of the Galicia Division as evidence of the futility of collaboration and the moral failure of anti-Soviet Ukrainian forces. Captured division members were paraded in Kyiv and other cities. Leaflets distributed along the front declared the annihilation of the Hitlerite Ukrainian unit, reinforcing the Soviet narrative that all national resistance to the USSR was inherently fascist. Many prisoners were later transferred to Soviet filtration camps, where they faced harsh interrogations, forced labor, or extended imprisonment. Some were executed under charges of treason. The defeat at Brody marked both an end and a beginning. The original Galicia Division ceased to exist as a fighting formation. Yet, German command, still in need of troops, would order its reconstruction. In the coming months, the division would be replenished with new recruits, reorganized, and deployed again, this time in different theaters and under shifting political circumstances. The legacy of Brody, however, would shadow the division's subsequent history. For its members and critics alike, the battle symbolized the dangers of strategic naivety, political misalignment, and the brutal calculus of total war. In the wake of the Brody encirclement, The Galicia Division faced a pivotal crossroads. The original formation had been largely destroyed in combat, and its survivability as a coherent military unit was in serious question. However, for both the German command and certain segments of the Ukrainian leadership, the idea of abandoning the division altogether was deemed premature. By mid-August 1944, orders were issued to begin its reconstitution, drawing upon surviving veterans, new Ukrainian volunteers, conscripts, and transferred personnel from various auxiliary police and rear area formations. The reorganization began at the SS training grounds in Neuhammer, Silesia, where the remnants of the division were concentrated. Approximately 3,000 to 4,000 men who had successfully escaped the Brody Pocket were joined by fresh recruits from Galicia and other Ukrainian regions still under German control. German recruiters also targeted Ukrainian laborers working in the Reich, offering improved conditions, military status, and the possibility of fighting against the Red Army. Despite the disaster at Brody, these promises, combined with the fear of Soviet reoccupation, convinced thousands to enlist. By November 1944, the division had been restructured and renamed. It was formally designated as the 14th Waffen Grenadier Division of the SS Galicia Nr. 1. While the Waffen SS numbering remained, there was a growing emphasis, especially in internal propaganda, on presenting the unit as a distinct national formation, with Ukrainian symbols, religious chaplains, and semi-autonomous cultural structures. German authorities allowed the reintroduction of Ukrainian insignia on uniforms, and Ukrainian became the primary language of internal communication within ranks. The new structure maintained the standard composition of a Waffen SS infantry division. It included 3 grenadier regiments, a reconnaissance battalion, artillery, engineer and signal units, medical services, and supply detachments. German officers retained key leadership positions, but an increasing number of Ukrainian junior officers were commissioned. The division's chaplaincy corps, led by Greek Catholic priests, played a significant role in morale building and in reinforcing the idea that service in the division was compatible with Christian and patriotic values. In the broader strategic context, Germany's position in late 1944 was rapidly deteriorating. Following Soviet advances into Hungary and Slovakia, the Reich's eastern borders were increasingly exposed. As part of its wider mobilization efforts, the Waffen-SS sought to deploy foreign divisions to support the faltering Axis lines and suppress resistance in occupied territories. The Galicia Division was thus assigned to counterinsurgency and rear area security operations in the territory of the Slovak Republic. From December 1944 to March 1945, the division operated in Slovakia and southern Poland. Its missions included guarding supply routes, clearing partisans from mountainous terrain, and maintaining order in zones where German authority was contested. The largest of these operations was Aktion Karpatenfest, aimed at crushing the Slovak national uprising, which had broken out in August 1944. While major combat had ended by October, insurgent activity persisted in remote regions of the Tatra Mountains and along the Slovak-Hungarian border. The Galicia Division's role in these operations remains the subject of historical scrutiny. While its primary duties involved anti-partisan sweeps and protection of infrastructure, reports indicate that units were involved in security measures that included the arrest of suspected partisans, house searches, and the forced relocation of civilians. In some instances, firefights erupted between division patrols and Slovak or Soviet-aligned resistance fighters, resulting in casualties on both sides. However, unlike in the case of certain other Waffen-SS divisions, there is no verified documentation of systematic atrocities or war crimes committed by the Galicia Division during its operations in Slovakia. Despite the relative calm of these months, morale within the division was mixed. Some soldiers viewed the assignment as a reprieve from the brutal combat experienced at Brody, while others expressed frustration at being diverted from their perceived primary mission, defending Ukrainian lands. Letters and internal reports suggest a growing awareness among troops that Germany was losing the war. Soviet advances into eastern Galicia and Volhynia had rendered the prospect of returning home increasingly unlikely. For many, the war had become a struggle for survival in a rapidly collapsing order. In early 1945, the division was transferred to Austria as part of the broader German reorganization in response to the Soviet and Allied offensives. The movement was part of SS plans to consolidate surviving foreign divisions in Central and Southern Europe, where remnants of German control persisted. In March, the Galicia Division was stationed near Graz, and shortly afterward it was integrated into the German 2nd Panzer Army, which was retreating before the Soviet advance into Austria and Yugoslavia. During this phase, the division received additional reinforcements, including Ukrainian personnel from disbanded auxiliary units and police formations. Training resumed in brief intervals between redeployments, and the division underwent further organizational adjustment. Notably, in April 1945, the German command authorized the creation of a Ukrainian National Army under General Pavlo Shandruk. The Galicia Division was transferred to this structure in principle, although in practice it remained under German operational control until the end of the war. The final military engagement of the Galicia Division occurred in the closing days of April and the first days of May 1945, during the retreat across Austria and Slovenia. Facing Soviet armored formations and partisan units in northern Yugoslavia, elements of the division were involved in rearguard actions intended to delay enemy pursuit and secure evacuation routes for German and Axis forces. Skirmishes occurred near towns such as Feldbach and Maribor, involving brief engagements with Tito's partisans and Red Army vanguards. As German command collapsed, the division began disintegrating. Units broke into small groups, some heading toward American lines, others toward the British sector. Leadership figures, including Shandruk, issued orders to move westward and surrender to Anglo-American forces rather than risk capture by the Red Army. By 8 May 1945, large contingents of the division had reached the British-controlled zone of Austria, particularly near the town of Radstadt. British forces initially treated the surrendered troops as regular enemy combatants. However, upon recognizing the division's composition and Ukrainian identification, a more cautious approach was adopted. Unlike Soviet citizens or SS personnel of German nationality, the Galicia Division's members were not automatically repatriated. This policy would become the subject of post-war political controversy and legal disputes. By the time the war in Europe formally ended, the Galicia Division had ceased to exist as a coherent military entity. From a peak strength of over 14,000, only about 8,000 survived to surrender in Austria. The rest had been killed, captured, or gone missing during the final months of retreat. For its members, the end of hostilities did not mean liberation, but the beginning of an uncertain exile, shadowed by accusations, investigations, and a legacy that would remain unresolved for decades. The transition from counterinsurgency in Slovakia to the collapse in Austria marked the division's final operational phase. It had begun as a political experiment wrapped in a military structure. It ended as a scattered force seeking refuge in a world that no longer acknowledged the promises once made to its members. The fighting was over, but the debate over what the Galicia division represented had only just begun. Following the surrender of the Galicia division to British forces in May 1945, the fate of its personnel became entangled in the complex legal, political, and diplomatic web of post-war Europe. Although active combat had ended, the status of the division's soldiers, members of a Waffen-SS formation, yet not German citizens, posed significant challenges for both Allied policymakers and Soviet authorities. Over the course of the next several years, the division's survivors would undergo internment, vetting, and relocation, while international controversy surrounded questions of war crimes, collaboration, and national identity. The soldiers of the Galicia division, numbering approximately 8,000 at the time of surrender, were disarmed by British units and placed in temporary detention camps in southern Austria. They were eventually transferred to Camp Bellaria near Spital an der Drau, and later to Rimini in northern Italy, which became the central internment site for the unit. British military authorities initially treated them as members of the German armed forces. However, it was soon noted that the vast majority were born outside the borders of pre-war Germany, primarily in the former eastern provinces of Poland, which the Soviet Union had annexed in 1939. This distinction became critical. The Soviet government, invoking the terms of the Yalta Conference, demanded the repatriation of all Soviet citizens, including those who had served in enemy or collaborationist formations. However, many of the Galicia Division's members insisted they were not Soviet citizens, as their place of birth had been part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire or interwar Poland, and that they had never accepted Soviet nationality. Ukrainian leaders in exile, including representatives of the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church and émigré political groups, mobilized to prevent forced repatriation, arguing that returning these individuals to the USSR would result in imprisonment, execution, or forced labor. British authorities, after internal reviews and consultations with legal experts, concluded that most division members could not be classified as Soviet citizens under international law. This conclusion was supported by the fact that many had never held Soviet passports or resided in the USSR prior to the 1939 annexation. Consequently, the British government refused Soviet repatriation requests, setting a precedent that would be applied to other displaced persons from Eastern Europe who had served in Axis-aligned forces. While this decision shielded Galicia Division veterans from forced return, it did not resolve their legal status. They remained in British custody for several years, while Allied war crimes investigators examined allegations regarding their wartime conduct. In 1947-1948, British and Canadian authorities conducted extensive inquiries into whether the division had been involved in atrocities, particularly against civilians or prisoners of war. These investigations included interviews, archival research, and cross-examination of personnel. The findings were mixed, but ultimately led to the conclusion that no actionable evidence of war crimes by the division as a whole could be substantiated. While certain individuals may have participated in local operations under German command, especially during early police service before the division's formal creation, there was no documentation or testimony that established collective responsibility or systematic crimes attributable to the division as a military formation. As a result, Allied authorities opted not to pursue prosecutions. With the legal questions partially resolved, attention turned to the future of the division's veterans. In 1947, Canada agreed to accept a group of approximately 2,000 former members under the condition that they undergo security screening and not be admitted as a collective military unit. These individuals were processed as agricultural and industrial workers under Canada's labor immigration program. In the following years, additional veterans emigrated to the United Kingdom, Australia, the United States, and Argentina, integrating into broader Ukrainian diaspora communities. The relocation and integration of Galicia Division veterans sparked debate in host countries. In Canada, parliamentary questions were raised about the wisdom of admitting former Waffen-SS soldiers, regardless of their ethnic origin. Jewish organizations and anti-fascist groups expressed concern that war criminals might be among those resettled. Ukrainian organizations countered that the division had been primarily motivated by anti-communism and the desire to defend Ukrainian territories, not ideological alignment with Nazism. The Canadian government, after additional reviews, upheld its decision, noting the absence of legal grounds for exclusion based solely on Waffen-SS affiliation. In the decades following resettlement, Galicia Division veterans played active roles in Ukrainian diaspora institutions. They established commemorative societies, published memoirs, and sponsored monuments and publications dedicated to preserving their version of historical memory. Annual gatherings, liturgies, and public events honored the fallen. Many former members became prominent figures in cultural, religious, and academic life, framing their service as a chapter in the larger narrative of Ukrainian resistance to Soviet domination. At the same time, the division's history remained controversial. Soviet historiography portrayed the unit as a fascist collaborationist force, citing its Waffen-SS designation as conclusive evidence of complicity in Nazi crimes. The narrative was reinforced through state propaganda, literature, and war memorials. In post-war Ukraine, then a Soviet republic, the division was taboo in official discourse, associated with treason and criminality. Families of veterans were often subjected to surveillance, and the topic was avoided in public education. The division also became a subject of academic scrutiny. Historians in the West began examining primary sources, including German military records, Allied intelligence files, and testimonies from both veterans and civilians. These studies highlighted the diversity of motivations among recruits, the limited operational independence of the unit, and the lack of conclusive evidence tying it to organized atrocities. However, some researchers noted that individual members may have served earlier in police battalions or SS auxiliary units implicated in war crimes, particularly in anti-partisan operations and Jewish deportations in 1941–1942. These associations complicated efforts to fully disentangle the division from the wider context of Nazi occupation policy. In the late 1980s and early 1990s, the fall of the Soviet Union reopened the debate. In independent Ukraine, discussions emerged about the division's place in national history. While many in Western Ukraine viewed the veterans as patriots who had fought against both totalitarian regimes, others criticized any rehabilitation of Waffen-SS formations, emphasizing the broader historical context of the Holocaust and Nazi occupation. The division's symbolism became a fault line in ongoing debates over memory, identity, and the legacy of the Second World War. By the early 21st century, commemorations of the Galicia division in diaspora communities remained active but increasingly subject to public controversy. In Canada and the UK, the presence of division monuments and graves became focal points of legal and moral challenges. Activists and scholars questioned whether honoring such units was compatible with democratic values. Governments occasionally launched inquiries, but rarely altered prior legal conclusions regarding the admissibility of former members. Thus, the immediate post-war years of the Galicia division were marked by legal ambiguity, political maneuvering, and the difficult process of displacement and adaptation. While the soldiers had survived the battlefield, they entered a new struggle over memory, legitimacy, and the right to define their past. The division had become not just a military unit, but a symbol, contested, politicized, and continually reinterpreted in the shifting landscapes of Cold War politics, exile nationalism, and post-Soviet nationhood. The narrative was far from settled, and in many ways, it had only just begun to unfold. In the decades following the Second World War, the legacy of the Galicia division evolved within a fragmented international context. While former members resettled across the globe, primarily in Canada, the United Kingdom, the United States, and Australia, the memory of the division became the subject of conflicting narratives shaped by the Cold War, émigré politics, Soviet propaganda, and post-war legal frameworks. What began as a military formation deployed on the Eastern Front became a symbol of broader debates over collaboration, national liberation, and historical responsibility. Within Ukrainian diaspora communities, especially those formed in Canada and Western Europe, the veterans of the Galicia division quickly established themselves as a distinct group. They founded veteran associations, published newsletters, and participated in community life as respected members of the post-war refugee intelligentsia. In Canada, the largest contingent settled primarily in Ontario and Manitoba, regions already home to significant pre-war Ukrainian populations. Here, the division's veterans integrated into Ukrainian Orthodox and Greek Catholic parishes, sponsored educational initiatives, and participated in annual memorial services. For many within these communities, the division was framed not in terms of the Waffen-SS or its association with Nazi Germany, but as a misunderstood national military effort. Veterans emphasized their anti-communist motivations, the coercive context of wartime recruitment, and the hope that the division might have served as the nucleus for an independent Ukrainian army. Published memoirs, such as those by divisional chaplains or officers, tended to highlight the unit's discipline, religious life, and suffering at Brody, while downplaying or denying participation in war crimes. In this narrative, The division was not a tool of Nazi policy, but a tragic and pragmatic response to the collapse of Polish sovereignty and the brutal Soviet occupation. Simultaneously, in the Soviet Union, the Galicia Division was incorporated into official historiography as a criminal entity. Soviet literature, textbooks, and films portrayed the division as a key example of Ukrainian nationalist treachery and Nazi collaboration. The division was often conflated with the broader activities of the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, OUN, and the Ukrainian Insurgent Army, UPA, further entrenching the perception that any Ukrainian nationalist activity during the war was inherently fascist. Soviet war memorials, particularly in western Ukraine, bore inscriptions condemning Banderites and Hitlerites, while NKVD and KGB archives categorized former division members and their families as politically unreliable for generations. This dichotomy between the diaspora's rehabilitation efforts and the Soviet state's criminalization campaign persisted for decades. However, it was not confined to rhetorical arenas. In the 1980s, a series of public controversies erupted in Canada and the United Kingdom when media outlets and advocacy groups began examining the wartime activities of immigrant populations. Accusations arose that Western governments had allowed alleged war criminals to settle in their countries after the war, often without adequate vetting. In Canada, this culminated in the 1985 establishment of the Commission of Inquiry on War Criminals, known as the Deschênes Commission. The commission investigated allegations that former members of Nazi-affiliated units, including the Galicia Division, had entered the country and avoided prosecution. After examining evidence from Allied archives, Soviet documents, and testimony from both veterans and survivors, the commission concluded that mere membership in the division did not constitute a war crime under international law. No evidence was found to link the division as a whole to crimes against humanity, and the Commission advised against initiating legal proceedings against its veterans. Nonetheless, the controversy reignited debates about national memory, immigration policy, and the ethical implications of resettling former Axis combatants. In the United Kingdom, similar discussions emerged, particularly around the time of the 50th anniversary of the end of World War II. Protests occurred at events where division veterans were present, especially at commemorations involving Ukrainian churches and cultural centers. The British government maintained that the division's surrender had been reviewed by military and legal authorities in 1945-1948, and that no actionable evidence of wrongdoing had emerged from those investigations. Despite this legal closure, the question of memorialization remained contentious. In Canada, monuments to the Galicia Division were erected in cemeteries and Ukrainian community centers. These monuments typically bore inscriptions honoring the memory of those who fought for Ukraine's freedom and included religious symbols and national imagery. Critics, including Jewish organizations and human rights groups, argued that such memorials glorified a unit affiliated with the Waffen-SS and ignored the broader context of the Holocaust and Nazi occupation policies. Supporters countered that the division had been unfairly stigmatized and that these memorials commemorated personal sacrifice rather than ideology. In Ukraine itself, the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 brought new opportunities for historical reassessment. In Western regions such as Lviv, Ivano-Frankivsk and Ternopil, where many of the division's original recruits had come from, public discourse increasingly turned toward rehabilitating figures and organizations previously vilified by the Soviet regime. Ukrainian historians, veterans' descendants, and nationalist political parties began to reframe the Galicia division as part of the broader national struggle against Soviet domination. Museums opened exhibits examining the wartime experience in a more pluralistic light. Some city councils officially recognized the division's veterans, while parades and commemorative events were held in their honor. At the same time, the division's connection to the Waffen-SS and the broader apparatus of Nazi occupation remained a sensitive issue, particularly in regions with significant Jewish and Polish populations. The 1943–1944 massacres of Poles in Volhynia and eastern Galicia by Ukrainian nationalist forces further complicated these discussions, even though the Galicia division itself was not directly involved in those atrocities. In this evolving landscape, memory politics became increasingly pronounced. Far-right groups and nationalist movements sometimes appropriated the division's symbols for contemporary political purposes, while liberal and left-leaning critics condemned any attempt to whitewash associations with Nazi Germany. In academic circles, efforts were made to produce more balanced accounts, exploring the division's recruitment, structure, battlefield history, and post-war fate using newly declassified archival materials from Germany, the Soviet Union, and the West. As of the early 21st century, the legacy of the Galicia division remains unresolved. In some diaspora communities, it is remembered as a tragic but honorable attempt to defend Ukraine's national interests during a time of existential peril. In others, it is viewed as an example of opportunistic collaboration and the dangers of ethnic militarization under totalitarian regimes. In Ukraine itself, official recognition of the division varies by region and government, reflecting broader tensions between civic nationalism, ethnic identity, and historical reckoning. What is clear is that the division's history cannot be reduced to a single narrative. It is a story of geopolitical manipulation, personal survival, ideological ambiguity, and the contested terrain of wartime memory. It reflects the difficult choices faced by individuals in occupied societies, the shifting morality of international politics, and the lasting impact of historical trauma across generations. As new research continues and public debate evolves, the Galicia division remains a case study in how history is not only written, but remembered, challenged, and redefined. As the Cold War progressed, the Galicia division became a focal point for competing narratives about collaboration, nationalism, and resistance, each shaped by geopolitical priorities and evolving historiographies. While the immediate post-war years had centered on legal status and individual accountability, the subsequent decades saw the division increasingly used as a symbolic touchstone, invoked in debates over identity, historical justice, and the ideological contours of Ukrainian memory in exile and under occupation. In the Soviet Union, the division continued to feature prominently in anti-nationalist propaganda well into the 1970s and 1980s. The Soviet security apparatus, particularly the KGB, monitored families of former division members, even those living outside the USSR. Veterans who remained in Soviet Ukraine or returned covertly were often arrested, interrogated, or exiled. Publications such as Literaturna Ukraina and Pravda regularly referenced the division as a tool of German fascism and framed its members as enemies of the people, part of a broader narrative linking Ukrainian nationalism with collaboration, subversion, and Western espionage. Soviet war films and historical novels reinforce this view, often depicting the Galicia division as indistinguishable from SS atrocities committed elsewhere in Europe. In many portrayals, its members appeared as caricatured villains, ruthless, ideologically motivated, and uniformly complicit in ethnic violence. These depictions rarely accounted for the unit's operational history or its internal diversity. The division thus served not only as a symbol of treason, but as a cautionary tale, a warning against deviations from Soviet patriotism and a justification for ongoing repression of nationalist sentiment. At the same time, in the Ukrainian diaspora, particularly in North America and Western Europe, former members of the division and their families undertook concerted efforts to defend their historical narrative. By the late 1960s, veterans organizations had established networks that published newsletters, organized academic conferences, and began assembling archives of divisional documents and personal testimonies. These efforts culminated in the publication of several substantial works, including divisional histories, edited volumes of memoirs, and even photographic collections. One of the most significant of these was The History of the 1st Division of the Ukrainian National Army, Galicia Division, published in English, Ukrainian, and German editions. Authored and compiled by veterans and sympathetic historians, the book presented the division as a disciplined and honorable military formation, distinct from other Waffen-SS units and driven by a commitment to resist Soviet domination. It emphasized the religious character of the troops, their cultural activities, and the hardships they endured, both at Brody and in Allied internment camps. In this version of history, the division's affiliation with the Waffen-SS was framed as a necessary compromise in the absence of other military avenues for Ukrainian self-determination. The narrative rejected the characterization of the unit as a tool of Nazi policy, and instead emphasized the autonomy of its leadership, the constraints placed upon it by the German command, and its reconstitution in 1945 as part of the short-lived Ukrainian National Army. This reframing became central to Ukrainian émigré identity, particularly among the second generation born in exile. The historiographical divide deepened with the passage of time. Western scholars, particularly those focusing on Eastern Europe, began revisiting the complexities of wartime collaboration and resistance. In the 1970s and 1980s, new academic work challenged simplistic dichotomies of victimhood and guilt. Studies of Baltic SS formations, the Polish Home Army, and Vlasov's Russian Liberation Army opened new frameworks for evaluating units like the Galicia Division, not as monolithic actors, but as products of unique local conditions, ideological shifts, and the collapse of state authority. Still, these more nuanced analyses remained largely inaccessible to the general public. In both East and West, most popular understanding continued to operate through polarized lenses, either as defenders of Ukrainian national honor or as complicit enablers of genocide. This binary became especially pronounced during anniversaries of the division's formation or demobilization, which were accompanied by articles, commemorative events, or counter-demonstrations depending on location and political climate. Meanwhile, the issue of war crimes continued to shadow the division's legacy. Although no direct link was ever established between the Galicia division and major atrocities such as the Holocaust, some historians and investigative journalists highlighted the overlap between early police battalions, in which future division members had served, and anti-partisan or anti-Jewish actions. Particular scrutiny fell on the region of western Ukraine during 1941–1942, where some auxiliary formations, before the division's official creation in 1943, had been involved in the deportation and killing of civilians. This overlap remained a source of unresolved tension. Veterans organizations categorically denied involvement in such activities, citing the division's formal establishment date and its separate training process. Critics argued that the distinction between auxiliary police and Waffen-SS recruitment was often blurred, and that accountability should extend to all levels of participation, including indirect support of occupation structures. The conflict over interpretation intensified during moments of political crisis. The Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in 1979, the imposition of martial law in Poland in 1981, and the Chernobyl disaster in 1986 all reinvigorated Cold War rhetoric. Soviet media outlets renewed their focus on the Galicia division as a way to discredit Ukrainian nationalist exiles and to delegitimize growing dissident movements in the Ukrainian SSR. At the same time, Ukrainian diaspora institutions rallied around the memory of the division as a symbol of enduring resistance to Kremlin domination. This narrative overlap fed into Cold War intelligence interests. Declassified records from the CIA and MI6 reveal that Western intelligence agencies occasionally maintained contact with former division members or used them as informal sources of information about Soviet military activity, émigré networks, or anti-communist resistance. Although never formally reactivated or armed, veterans of the division were seen as politically reliable anti-Soviet actors during a time when ideological loyalty often trumped reputational baggage. By the late 1980s, the beginning of perestroika and glasnost in the USSR opened previously suppressed historical discussions. Ukrainian intellectuals in Lviv, Ternopil, and Kyiv began organizing informal historical circles, producing samizdat publications, and collecting oral testimonies that challenged Soviet orthodoxies. Among these efforts was a renewed interest in World War II history from a Ukrainian perspective, including the divisive question of the Galicia division. These early post-Soviet discussions were cautious, often couched in terms of scholarly inquiry rather than outright rehabilitation. Still, they marked a turning point. For the first time in decades, the division's legacy could be discussed in Ukraine itself, tentatively and with acknowledgement of its political complexity. Local historians began accessing previously classified Soviet files, while journalists conducted interviews with surviving veterans in Ukraine who had lived in silence under Soviet rule. At the close of the Cold War, the Galicia division remained a symbol suspended between competing historical currents. For the USSR and its ideological successors, it represented collaboration and betrayal. For the diaspora, it symbolized sacrifice and national awakening. And for historians increasingly immersed in the archive wars of the late 20th century, it represented a cautionary case, one where the lines between coercion, ideology, and agency had become dangerously blurred. As Ukrainian independence loomed on the horizon, so too did the possibility of reassessing the division on Ukrainian soil, not as a myth or a weapon, but as a subject of honest, rigorous, and deeply necessary historical examination. The next chapter of the division's story would be written not in the exile press or secret police files, but in a newly sovereign country, still wrestling with its past. With the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 and the emergence of an independent Ukrainian state, the historical narrative surrounding the Galicia division entered a radically new phase. For the first time, open discussion about the unit's origins, activities, and post-war legacy became legally and publicly possible within Ukraine itself. The lifting of Soviet-era taboos enabled access to previously classified archives, created space for the expression of diverse perspectives, and ushered in a process of national historical redefinition. Yet this new environment did not lead to consensus. Rather, it exposed the deep regional, ideological, and generational divides that continue to shape Ukrainian memory politics. In western Ukraine, especially in Lviv, Ivano-Frankivsk, and Ternopil oblasts, the Galicia division was widely reassessed as part of the broader history of Ukrainian resistance against Soviet domination. Local historians, former underground dissidents, and nationalist organizations emphasize the division's anti-Bolshevik orientation, its primarily Ukrainian ethnic composition, and its symbolic value as a precursor to the modern Ukrainian armed forces. In public discourse, the division was often grouped with the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, OUN, and the Ukrainian Insurgent Army, UPA, as entities that, despite controversial affiliations, had ultimately fought for the cause of national self-determination. Monuments were erected and streets renamed in honor of Galicia Division veterans. Local councils passed resolutions recognizing the division as a legitimate military formation. Veterans associations, which had long operated in exile, began coordinating with counterparts inside Ukraine, organizing conferences, memorial events, and exhibitions. Greek Catholic and Orthodox priests conducted liturgies in memory of fallen soldiers. Cultural institutions, such as the Lviv Historical Museum and regional libraries, curated exhibitions presenting the division as part of the Ukrainian national revival. This re-evaluation was not universally accepted. In central, eastern, and southern Ukraine, regions shaped more directly by Soviet wartime memory, public sentiment toward the Galicia division remained wary or openly hostile. Many Ukrainians in these areas had been educated within a Soviet framework that portrayed the division as a Nazi-aligned force guilty of crimes against civilians and part of a larger betrayal of the Soviet homeland. These views were especially prevalent among veterans of the Red Army, war survivors, and members of the older generation. National authorities in Kyiv initially maintained a cautious distance from the controversy. While local commemorations proceeded in western regions, successive presidential administrations avoided issuing formal recognition of the division or its members. Ukraine's early post-independence leaders prioritized state unity, economic stabilization, and international diplomacy over direct involvement in divisive historical questions. Official historical policy remained ambiguous, with textbooks and public statements reflecting a blend of Soviet-era narratives, Western scholarship, and nationalist reinterpretations. At the same time, the new era of archival openness permitted the emergence of more nuanced academic treatments of the division's history. Ukrainian scholars, often working in cooperation with Western historians, began to explore the operational, political, and cultural dimensions of the unit. Research based on German military records, Soviet NKVD files, and personal memoirs painted a more complex picture of the division, not as a unified ideological force, but as a formation shaped by wartime coercion, ethnic identity, and strategic ambiguity. These studies revealed significant internal variation in the motives of recruits. Some had joined to resist Soviet reoccupation, others out of hope for future autonomy, while many sought better treatment compared to forced laborers or conscripts in other German units. While the division's association with the Waffen-SS remained undeniable, it did not share the ideological or genocidal orientation of elite SS formations such as Totenkopf or Das Reich. There was no documented evidence linking the division as a unit to participation in the Holocaust or other systematic war crimes, though questions remained about the wartime record of individual members and pre-division affiliations. In parallel, international debates over the division intensified. In Canada, monuments erected by Ukrainian diaspora communities became the target of media scrutiny and political pressure. Journalists and advocacy organizations questioned the presence of memorials to a Waffen-SS unit on Canadian soil, particularly in the context of post-war immigration policies. The issue sparked parliamentary debates, editorials, and legal inquiries, though no changes were made to immigration law or the status of the veterans involved. Canadian government investigations reiterated the conclusions of the Deschênes Commission. That division membership alone was not grounds for legal action. Russia, for its part, responded to the division's rehabilitation with increasing hostility. The Russian state and media repeatedly cited commemorative events in Ukraine as evidence of neo-Nazism, historical revisionism, and a rejection of the Soviet victory in World War II. These claims intensified following the 2004 Orange Revolution, and especially after the 2014 Euromaidan uprising and subsequent Russian military interventions in Crimea and Donbass. Russian officials invoked the Galicia division to delegitimize Ukrainian nationalism and to reinforce the Kremlin's narrative of a Ukraine infiltrated by fascist elements. In this context, events such as the annual marches in Lviv honoring the division's formation became internationally controversial. Coverage by Russian and some Western outlets portrayed the events as celebrations of Nazism, while Ukrainian organizers and participants described them as acts of remembrance and national dignity. Critics argued that honoring the division risked legitimizing collaboration and whitewashing the Nazi occupation, while supporters emphasized the distinctiveness of the Ukrainian experience and the complexity of wartime choices. Amid these tensions, Ukrainian state policy began to shift. In 2015, the Ukrainian parliament passed a package of decommunization laws aimed at removing Soviet symbols, renaming streets, and opening up the archives of the communist-era security services. One provision recognized fighters for Ukrainian independence in the 20th century, including members of the OUN, UPA, and related formations, as veterans with legal protections. While the Galicia division was not named explicitly, The move signaled a broader trend toward recognizing anti-Soviet resistance, regardless of its wartime affiliations. Critics, both domestic and international, warned that such legislation risked politicizing history and obscuring moral responsibility. Supporters argued that Ukraine had the right to define its own historical heroes, particularly in the face of foreign aggression and information warfare. Academic institutions attempted to mediate the dispute by convening roundtables, publishing source collections, and fostering dialogue between scholars of differing perspectives. As Ukraine entered a new phase of nation-building amid war and political upheaval, the Galicia division continued to serve as a prism through which broader questions were refracted. What does it mean to resist occupation? How should collaboration be judged? Can national memory coexist with moral accountability? And who gets to define the past? The division's resurgence in Ukrainian public life reflected a growing desire to reclaim historical agency after decades of Soviet erasure. Yet it also underscored the enduring challenges of post-colonial remembrance. In reclaiming their history, Ukrainians confronted not only the silences of the Soviet era, but the ambiguities, compromises, and tragedies of their own wartime experience. Thus, by the late 2010s, the Galicia division stood at the crossroads of scholarship, commemoration, and political conflict. It had become more than a military formation. It was now a vessel for contested meanings, a mirror of national fragmentation and resilience, and a reminder that the history of war is never only about the battles fought, but about the truths remembered and the silences preserved. By the beginning of the 2020s, the legacy of the Galicia division had crystallized into one of the most divisive and politically charged subjects within Ukrainian historical discourse and international debate. As Ukrainian society sought to forge a coherent national identity amid war, revolution, and external aggression, the question of how to commemorate or contextualize controversial historical actors, like the division, took on renewed urgency. No longer a purely academic matter, the memory of the division intersected directly with Ukraine's struggle for sovereignty, its geopolitical orientation, and its complex relationship with the past. The escalation of Russian military aggression in 2014 and the full-scale invasion in 2022 transformed the politics of memory within Ukraine. In the face of existential threat, narratives emphasizing national resistance to Soviet and Russian imperialism gained prominence. Symbols associated with Ukrainian wartime independence movements, including the red and black flag of the OUN and elements of the Galicia division's history, were increasingly incorporated into public commemorations, military ceremonies, and educational materials, particularly in Western regions and among nationalist organizations. For proponents of the division's rehabilitation, its symbolic value was clear, a historical example of Ukrainians organizing militarily to defend their homeland, albeit within the deeply compromised context of World War II. They argued that while the Waffen-SS affiliation was problematic, it had been instrumental, not ideological, and did not negate the division's Ukrainian identity. These advocates positioned the division within a broader anti-colonial narrative that framed Ukrainian history as a continuous struggle against occupation. First Polish, then Soviet, then Nazi, and once again Russian. This interpretation found support in local governments, veteran groups, and segments of civil society, especially in Galicia. Streets and schools were named after divisional figures, and annual remembrance events were organized in Lviv, often attended by elderly veterans and younger nationalist activists. Ukrainian media outlets occasionally featured stories highlighting the personal experiences of division members, focusing on their motivations, hardships, and post-war lives in exile or Soviet persecution. Yet the broader public reception remained uneven. National surveys revealed a consistent regional divide in attitudes toward the division, with favorable views concentrated in the West and significantly more skepticism or disapproval in central and eastern Ukraine. Critics within Ukraine argued that honoring the division alienated parts of the population, including many who had served in the Red Army or whose families had suffered under both Nazi and nationalist violence. The memory of World War II, long dominated by Soviet victory mythology, remained potent, particularly in regions with strong veteran communities and deep wartime scars. Internationally, the resurgence of Galicia Division commemorations triggered sharp responses. The Russian Federation, already engaged in an extensive disinformation campaign aimed at discrediting Ukraine's government and armed forces, seized upon the division's symbolism as proof of neo-Nazism in Ukrainian public life. Russian state media produced documentaries and reports alleging that Ukraine was glorifying fascism and rewriting history. These accusations, though politically motivated and exaggerated, gained traction in some circles, particularly among Western audiences unfamiliar with the division's actual history or the broader context of Ukrainian national movements. Western governments and institutions found themselves in a difficult position. While most rejected Russia's characterizations, they also expressed concern about the implications of state or municipal endorsements of former Waffen-SS formations. In countries like Canada and Germany, Ukrainian diaspora activities involving commemorations of the division occasionally sparked protests or led to inquiries. For example, renewed investigations into division members buried in Canadian cemeteries or the presence of SS insignia on diaspora monuments provoked diplomatic controversy and public debate. These tensions were further heightened by the growing global movement for historical justice and the re-evaluation of commemorative landscapes. Across Europe and North America, statues and memorials connected to colonialism, slavery, or authoritarian regimes came under scrutiny. In this environment, the presence of memorials to a Waffen-SS division, even one composed largely of non-Germans, was increasingly questioned. Ukrainian scholars and institutions responded to these challenges in different ways. Some advocated for a clearer distinction between remembrance and glorification, calling for context-rich commemorative practices that acknowledged the complexity of the division's formation and actions. Others argued for a shift in focus, from divisive wartime figures to inclusive narratives of resistance, cultural survival, and civic solidarity. New academic publications, museum exhibits, and documentary films emerged aiming to bridge the gap between political memory and critical scholarship. The Institute of National Memory in Ukraine, under successive leaderships, vacillated between cautious endorsement of nationalist commemorations and attempts to moderate the more controversial aspects of wartime remembrance. Its publications acknowledged the division's service under the Waffen-SS, but emphasized its autonomy, battlefield conduct, and persecution under both Soviet and Nazi regimes. However, these narratives were still contested, and public trust in government-sponsored memory initiatives remained fragile. Meanwhile, the digitization of Soviet archives and wartime documents made independent research increasingly accessible. International scholars, including those from Germany, Israel, Poland, and Ukraine, continued to publish work interrogating the division's military record, recruitment process, and post-war mythologization. These studies largely agreed on a few key points. The division was not responsible for the Holocaust. Its Waffen-SS designation was bureaucratically and politically driven, and its combat history, while marked by loss and hardship, did not include evidence of systematic war crimes. However, the presence of individuals with prior service in auxiliary police battalions, some of which had participated in crimes against civilians, remained a stain on the division's legacy. The difficulty of separating individual culpability from collective identity haunted commemorative efforts, and calls for more rigorous vetting of veterans' biographies resurfaced periodically. Holocaust remembrance organizations continued to monitor the issue, wary of historical whitewashing. Within Ukraine, generational change also influenced perceptions. Younger Ukrainians, especially those shaped by the 2013-2014 Euromaidan protests and the ongoing war with Russia, often viewed history through a prism of sovereignty and resistance. For some, the Galicia division represented a moment of agency in an otherwise traumatic and externally dominated past. For others, it remained an uncomfortable reminder of the compromises and moral ambiguities of wartime nationalism. Education reform played a role in shaping these views. History curricula were updated to reflect a wider range of sources and interpretations, including topics previously censored under Soviet rule. However, teaching about the Galicia division remained sensitive. Instructors often avoided the topic or presented it in broad strokes to prevent polarization. Civic organizations stepped in to provide supplemental materials and facilitate school discussions, though resources varied by region and funding. By the end of the decade, the Galicia division remained a contested memory, a symbol of resistance to some, of betrayal to others, and of historical entanglement to many. As Ukraine moved toward a more pluralistic and democratic society, the question was no longer simply whether to condemn or glorify the division, but how to integrate its story into a broader narrative that accounted for the full spectrum of wartime experience. In that task, historians, educators, survivors, and citizens faced a shared responsibility to navigate the space between silence and myth, to honor complexity without evading accountability, and to recognize that history's burden is not in choosing sides, but in understanding why sides were chosen. The Galicia division, once buried under decades of propaganda and polemic, now stood exposed, its full legacy still unfolding. The final reckoning of the Galicia division's history did not arrive with a single verdict, monument, or political declaration. Instead, it evolved as part of Ukraine's broader confrontation with the legacies of war, occupation, collaboration, and resistance. As the post-Soviet world matured, and as Ukraine increasingly positioned itself as a sovereign European nation, the division's story became a mirror reflecting not only the moral complexities of the 20th century, but also the ongoing challenges of national memory in the 21st. Among scholars and historians, consensus grew around several core conclusions. The division's formation in 1943 emerged from a specific confluence of political desperation, German manpower needs, and Ukrainian nationalist aspirations. Its members, numbering over 80,000 volunteers and conscripts throughout its existence, were drawn by a mix of motives: a desire to resist Bolshevism, a hope for Ukrainian autonomy, fear of Soviet return, or simply the need to survive in a brutal and collapsing wartime order. The division's battlefield record was limited and marked by strategic defeats, most notably the annihilation at Brody in July 1944, where thousands perished or were captured. The unit was reconstituted but never achieved significant independent combat success before its surrender in Austria in May 1945. Crucially, no credible evidence has linked the Galicia Division as a formation to participation in the Holocaust. However, some individuals who later served in the division had prior involvement in auxiliary police units implicated in atrocities against Jews and other civilians. This fact continues to cast a shadow over commemorative efforts and remains a point of contention among historians, survivors, and descendants of victims. The distinction between individual culpability and institutional responsibility remains a central ethical and historiographical dilemma. The Soviet Union's post-war propaganda apparatus depicted the division as traitorous, branding all members as fascist collaborators. Many were captured and sentenced to labor camps or execution. Yet thousands managed to reach Western Europe and resettled in countries such as the United Kingdom, Canada, Australia, and the United States. In exile, they became pillars of Ukrainian diaspora communities, maintaining a complex identity that combined elements of victimhood, resistance, and nationalist pride. Veterans associations organized memorial events, published memoirs, and supported anti-Soviet causes throughout the Cold War. During the Nuremberg trials and subsequent investigations, the Galicia Division was not classified as a criminal organization, unlike the broader Waffen-SS. This legal distinction formed the basis for many post-war resettlement claims and reinforced the argument among some in the Ukrainian community that the division was politically and ethnically distinct from Nazi structures. Nonetheless, debates persisted in host countries about the ethics of harboring former Waffen-SS members, regardless of their personal records. In modern Ukraine, state-level approaches to the division's legacy have been inconsistent. While the government has not officially recognized the division as heroic, it has also refrained from condemnation. In 2015, Ukraine passed decommunization laws that removed legal protections for Soviet-era narratives and memorials, creating space for nationalist reinterpretations of the past. This legal framework enabled local commemorations of the division in Lviv and other Western cities, but it also sparked internal protest and international scrutiny. The Ukrainian parliament never formally endorsed these events, but neither did it suppress them. Memorials to the Galicia Division exist today in both Ukraine and the diaspora. In Lviv, plaques and museum exhibits mark the role of the division in local history. In Canadian cities such as Edmonton and Toronto, monuments in cemeteries and Ukrainian cultural centers commemorate the division's veterans. Some of these have been vandalized. others quietly removed after public outcry. The continued presence or absence of such memorials serves as a litmus test for the evolving public memory of the war and its actors. In recent years, transnational dialogues between Ukrainian, Polish, Israeli, and Western scholars have expanded the research base and helped clarify the division's historical footprint. Academic conferences, joint publications, and archival cooperation have uncovered new documents and testimonies. These efforts aim to foster a more nuanced understanding that neither glorifies nor demonizes, but instead situates the division within the full complexity of Eastern Europe's wartime experience, marked by shifting front lines, ideological extremes, ethnic violence, and the collapse of state structures. Public opinion in Ukraine remains fragmented. Polling data consistently shows that attitudes toward the division vary sharply by region, age, and political affiliation. For younger generations raised in an independent Ukraine, the division is often one episode among many in a vast and difficult national history. For older citizens, especially those who fought in the Red Army or lost relatives to German occupation, the division can still evoke deep resentment. These emotional and generational divides underscore the need for responsible public history and inclusive remembrance. The global context has also influenced how the division is remembered. As far-right movements re-emerge across Europe and North America, historical symbols are increasingly scrutinized for their potential appropriation or misuse. Ukrainian officials have become more cautious in their messaging, emphasizing democratic values and pluralism. At the same time, Russian disinformation continues to weaponize the division's history, using it as part of a broader strategy to portray Ukraine as ideologically tainted and unworthy of Western support. Amid these pressures, Ukrainian civil society has played a vital role in shaping historical discourse. Independent museums, documentary filmmakers, grassroots educators, and local historians have produced content aimed at fostering dialogue rather than polarization. Projects like oral history collections, digital archives, and multi-language publications seek to engage broad audiences and humanize the past without sanitizing it. These efforts represent a significant shift away from ideological narrative control toward a more participatory and critical memory culture. The Galicia division story, in the end, defies simplification. It cannot be reduced to heroism or treason, victimhood or guilt. It reflects the collision of imperial collapse, ideological war, national aspiration, and personal survival. Its members were neither monolithic nor wholly voluntary. Their decisions were made under extreme conditions, with incomplete information and no guarantee of outcome. For historians, citizens, and policymakers, acknowledging that complexity is not an evasion of truth, but a commitment to it. As Ukraine continues its journey through war, nation-building, and historical reconciliation, the Galicia division will remain a point of contention and inquiry. Its legacy may never unite the country, but its study can illuminate the shadows where history and memory meet. Through careful research, respectful debate, and open acknowledgement of painful truths, future generations may come to understand not only what the division was, but why it still matters, and why the past must be remembered with both honesty and care.